Ho 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 and welcome everyone to the Inside Java Newscast, where we cover recent developments in the OpenJDK community. I'm Nicolaus Parlock, Java developer advocate at Oracle and bringer of presents, and today we're gonna unbox 24 Java features you missed in 2022. From language features to API additions, from tooling to performance, my advent calendar is filled to the brim. Wait. It's not Nicolaus who brings the advent calendar, right? And doesn't this look like Santa Claus cap? Also, this fake fur jacket looks way kinkier than anything either of the two would ever wear. Never mind. I can't do the voice the entire episode anyway. I'll just look weird then. So are you ready for 24 features? Small and large, safe and fast? Then let's dive right in. JDK 19 famously previews Project Loom's virtual threads, and people have also taken note of the structured concurrency API it is incubating. One aspect of that approach to concurrency that can hardly be overstated is the relationship it introduces between threads. If one thread launches a few subtasks, each in their own thread, and then waits for them to complete, there's a clear parent-child relationship between those threads. And it's expressed at runtime, so it's visible in thread dumps and during debugging. In fact, just the other day I noticed that IntelliJ now allows navigation of the hierarchy. So cool! This will be a game changer for debugging, when you can go from any random subtask that you paused in all the way up to the very thread that handles the entire use case or request. Speaking about structured concurrency, it relies on the class Future, but you'll usually only ask instances of them for exceptions or results when they are already completed. To make that easier to determine and request, Future got 3 new methods. Exception now, to immediately return the exception thrown by the task, result now, to immediately return the task's result, and state to check whether the future is in an appropriate state to request exception or result, because if it's not, the other 2 methods throw illegal state exceptions. More has changed for pre-existing concurrency APIs in JDK 9. ForkJoinTask got 2 new variants of joining quietly, namely quietly join with timeout and quietly join uninterruptedly, also with timeout. On ForkJoinPool, you can now submit tasks lazily that you don't need to execute if contention is high with lazy submit, and with set parallelism you can set the pool's target parallelism after creation. When you know exactly how many elements your hash set has to contain, how do you create one of correct size so that no resizing is necessary? Pass that number as initial capacity to the constructor? Nope, because there's a load factor in play, usually 75%. Once the set contains that many elements relative to capacity, it will resize. To avoid the resize, you can compute capacity from expected element count via the load factor, or you can use the static factor method new HashSet that was added in JDK 19 and pass in the number of mappings. It will do the math for you. Same for HashMap, by the way, except it's called new HashMap, obviously. The GitHub Action Oracle Action/setup Java allows you to easily set up various OpenJDK builds from jdk.java.net. General availability builds, currently JDK 19. Early access builds of mainline JDK, for example JDK 20 and soon JDK 21. And early access builds of projects like Loom and Panama. It also allows you to set up Oracle JDK builds from oracle.com/java. The NTFC license gives you a lot of leeway to use it for free. Say you have a vector of RGB values and you want to create a new vector with just the reds at the beginning and everything else set to 0. How do you do that? A rearrange with a shuffle and a mask would do the trick, but it's tedious and non-obvious. JDK 19 added a more succinct operation to the vector API to accomplish this. Compress. Just pass in a mask of the lanes you want to select, and they'll be placed in a continuous section at the beginning of the result vector with everything else set to 0. To go the other way, use expand. Starting from index 0, lanes are parceled out into each result lane where the mask is true. Spiritually speaking, compress and expand are inverse to one another, but not quite because both lose information, namely the non-selected lanes. But if you compress and then expand with the same mask, you get the input vector back with all lanes that the mask didn't select set to 0. Beautiful. Now here's a cool thing. Take an int, 32 bits, and imagine it as a vector with 32 lanes. Compressing and expanding applies here too, right? And the mask would be 32 booleans, bits, so another int. Hence, integer got new static methods compress and expand that accept the input vector and the vector mask as int arguments and return an int. Same for long, but with long.
By the way, at least on x86 processors, this is implemented as an intrinsic, leveraging the PEXT instruction, which makes it lightning fast. You write Javadoc, right? And you use doclint to search for potential problems, right? And you fix all of those immediately, right? If you answered yes, yes, no, respectively, then I got good news for you. You can now suppress doclint warnings with the usual suppress warnings annotation. Since 2017, the G1 garbage collector deduplicates strings, meaning it detects string instances that are equal and retains only a single copy of the backend character array. Measurements done on a large number of Java applications, big and small, have shown that on average 25% of heap data are string objects and about 13.5 are duplicated. Removing their backend character arrays reduces memory footprint by roughly 10%. Since JDK 17, Shenandoah, and since JDK 18, ZGC, ZeroGC, and ParallelGC also support string deduplication. Damn it. If I can't even get deduplication out, I probably need a break. So let's have one. By the way, I have a question. On another newscast recently, I mentioned that this is a different newscast because you actually have to sit down and watch the screen, whereas the other ones, like this one, usually don't. You might be, like preparing lunch or putting together the laundry or whatever, and can still listen to me. And I asked myself, what are you actually doing? Like, how do you usually watch these episodes? I'm really curious to find out, so please leave a comment. I really want to know. Also, let's change this around a bit. Wait, what? There and there. Oh man. See? There we go. Okay, coming back to G1. The maximum allowed heap region size of 32 megabytes can cause inner and outer fragmentation issues with large objects on large heaps. On very large heaps, it leads to increased internal region management overhead and decreased performance due to larger local allocation buffers. Since JDK 18, it's possible to manually increase the heap region size beyond 32 megabytes up to 512 megabytes with the command line option -XX:G1 heap region size. Good, right? That was good? Pause worked. Let's keep going. JDK 19 ships with several performance improvements for security-related code. The JDK's SHA-3 message digest algorithm performance has been increased by up to 2x. The local certificate objects used to resume a TLS session from stateless session tickets are now cached and reused, which reduces memory consumption. SSL algorithm constraints are no longer evaluated twice, which increases TLS handshake performance. Another speed up in the same area comes from caching the results of constraints checks. Got all that? Me neither, but good to know that Java gets faster. To turn a datetime into a string, you need a datetime formatter. Creating custom formatters is easy with the static factory method of pattern. And creating localized formatters is easy too, as long as you stick with the 4 predefined format styles, short, medium, long, and full. But what about custom localized formatters? JDK 19 is there for you. It adds the static factory method datetime formatter of localized pattern that accepts Unicode skeletons, which only define what fields you want to include, but leave the formatting in order for the localization to determine. The datetime formatter builder class was also extended with the methods getLocalized datetime pattern and append localized. Since JDK 19, Javadoc Search box can handle multiple search terms, and to make it easier to navigate results, there's now a page for those. This seemingly small change has a pretty cool consequence. We can now sidestep the entire Java version search fiasco and create a custom browser search for each JDK version we want. If you don't know how to do that, I'll link to explanations for Firefox and Chrome in the description. The new option -provider path has been added to jarsigner. It allows you to specify the class path of an alternate key store implementation and can be used in conjunction with the -provider class option. The class JavaNet INET address is in charge of resolving host names and addresses, for which it relies on the operating system's native resolver, which is typically configured to use a combination of local hosts file and the domain name system. That has a few downsides. For one, it clashes with virtual threads because for the time being, file system access pins them to platform threads. And then it makes it harder to impossible to support emerging network protocols, customization or testing. So since JDK 18, you can plug in your own resolver for host names and addresses by implementing the classes INET address resolver and Idris. Since the announcement that Idris Elba is going to be in Cyberpunk 2077? Anyway, you have to implement INET address resolver and INET address resolver provider and register the latter as a service. On macOS, an alternative implementation of the Java 2D rendering pipeline was developed that uses the Apple Metal API instead of the deprecated OpenGL API. It's fully functional and generally performs better, sometimes by a lot, than the OpenGL implementation. That happened for JDK 17, but in 19 the new pipeline became the default. This thing is itchy. Let's take it off. Oh crap, we can have that. Better. Part of the Java Authentication Authorization Service, JAAS, how nobody calls it, depends on the security manager, which, as you probably know, is deprecated for removal. So in JDK 18, 2 new methods were added to the JAAS class subject. CallAs is a replacement for doAs, and current is a replacement for getSubject. The new methods are similar to, but a bit simpler than the old ones, which are deprecated for removal. I'm sure you've heard about record patterns, which preview in JDK 19, and that you can use them to deconstruct a record into its constituent components. But did you notice that you can also assign the record itself to a variable? This is called a named pattern, and is really useful when you need to reference the record itself too. And it becomes outright magical when you nest record patterns, because then you can capture an inner component while destructuring it further. Need a web server to launch a static site, maybe for demos or tests? Since Java 18, the JDK ships with the web server, which you can launch with the binary JWebServer. You can do a few fancier things with it, there's a link to an article in the description, but overall it's intentionally simple and explicitly not meant to be used in production. And that's all the 24 Java features Santa Nicholas or whoever brought in his cap. That's how this works, right? But I found a few more and put them into a pinned comment. Check it out if you're interested, and maybe spring a like or subscribe while you're at it. And that's it for 2022 on the Inside Java Newscast. What a year! Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you a relaxing few days with friends and family before the craziness returns in January. So long!